Welcome back, everyone, to Progressively Incorrect. My name is Zach Groeschel, and I am so excited today to be interviewing Jonah Davids about a topic that's on everybody's mind, which is sort of the mental health approaches and the so-called crisis around mental health. Very excited to pick his brain in just a moment, but a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The first is that this podcast is brought to you by John Catt from Hachette Learning, my most trusted publisher for evidence-informed education books. Bulk orders for schools are possible for books such as my book, Just Tell Them: The Power of Explanations and Explicit Teaching. Follow the links in the show notes and start your science of learning journey. And my second item is for principals, instructional coaches, and school leaders who run PD and coaching programs. Many of you are looking for evidence-informed PD for yourselves to help you embed the ideas of this podcast into your contexts. Step Lab has just announced multiple intensive trainings for instructional leaders and aspiring ones in locations across North America this year. Please visit my website, educationrickshaw.com/coach, to see what is happening in a city near you. So yeah, Jonah, that's enough from the sponsors and from the great events happening around my spaces. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
You know, we were just recently on a panel together. I think the first question was the one that really it divided the panel, and that we were asked how behavior is going. Maybe you can take us through this. Maybe starting with at a very high level, why do students misbehave, and what's been going on with behavior in recent years?
All right, well, I think that's the most important question, and it gets into something that in policy discussions and professional discussions we don't always talk too much about, which is like our actual understanding of human behavior, right? And so what you find typically these days is, and we're talking about why are students misbehaving, which could be anything from, acting out in terms of like being annoying, speaking during class, all the way up to someone actually being violent and hitting another kid or a teacher or something, right? So where does this come from? Well, I think the simple answer we got to start with is, okay, well, what are humans? Humans are basically animals, right? We're rational animals, but we're animals. And so there's many reasons why people do misbehave and would, right? If you want something and I have it, it makes sense for you to attack me and to take it yourself if there's nothing stopping you. Or if you don't have, at that point, a moral conscience about that kind of behavior. If a kid is bored in school, it makes sense that they would act out and start being annoying. If they're bored, of course they want to talk to their friends, right? And if a kid is just feeling very aggressive or whatever and wants to be violent, they're going to be violent if there's nothing stopping them. And so I think the thing that we got to think about to begin with is, why is it that students behave at school at all or in life at all? And that's because we have rules, we have norms, we have expectations. This is basically what civilization is. This is what keeps people on track, is that if you behave in an inappropriate or violent way, there's going to be a consequence or a repercussion. Now, predating the pandemic, kind of beginning in the 2010s, there's been this effort in schools to sort of have softer consequences for misbehavior. And this comes out of concerns that, students are being over-disciplined. They often talk about zero tolerance discipline and things like that, which is sort of, 3 strikes you're out, or you do something, you're out of the class. And there was also a lot of concern that students who are minorities or who were disabled were committing, these kinds of outbursts and offenses and things at higher rates. And so they wanted to try to, bring those more into line. And so what ended up happening is you had these, federal and state kind of mandates to bring down suspensions, bring down misbehavior. Now, the issue was that this basically left schools with this problem, which is, okay, well, we need to have students behaving better, but we also are supposed to be reducing suspensions and all these tools that we use classically to improve behavior. And so what do? And so they came up with all these, I shouldn't say that schools came up with this, but consultants and academics came up with these things like restorative justice, restorative practices, social emotional learning, which is sort of older, but then was brought in more aggressively here, mental health. And the idea behind this was actually the real reason that students are misbehaving is because they are in a bad mood, or they have problems at home, or they have, an undiagnosed mental illness or something like that. What we've kind of seen post-pandemic is that this has become basically the only way that most schools are now looking at misbehavior, is if the kid is misbehaving, it's because there's something wrong with the kid's mental health or wrong with the home situation. But I don't think we need to focus even too much on schools to kind of make sense of this, because if you look around society post-pandemic, we've just kind of, really let ourselves go with all kinds of rules. We now have people walking around littering. There's, more of just outward homelessness and drug use and things in the streets. And this is just because during the pandemic, we kind of all gave ourselves a bit of a break of like, okay, this is not the time, if now we're not going to crack down on people too hard because we've got this virus that we're dealing with. And unfortunately, these norms have kind of persisted, and it's hard to put that back in the box, so to speak. And so I think now we're at a situation with schools where you've got all kinds of reports from, students, principals, teachers that they're really worried about behavior. They're worried about annoying behavior, but also violent behavior. You now even have teachers unions and things coming and saying like, we need stricter behavioral rules and things. And yet the response from a lot of schools and a lot of, policy groups and stuff has not just been to go back to the kind of classic way of dealing with this, which is to have simple rules to enforce them pretty strictly, but to try and deal with kids' mental health issues. And so my real, point being here today and talking about this is just to say, I don't really think this makes sense, because that's not what causes bad behavior in the first place. It's not mental health issues. Of course, like that could be a cause, but it doesn't take much to explain why kids behave badly at all. The real question is, why are they now, being allowed to get away with it?
Absolutely. I wonder if there's a bit of a movement, or there's some changes in some spaces where finally people are realizing this in schools. But I think you just got a taste of it in that panel we shared, and where I will attend, school meetings and places, and that's basically the narrative is the opposite of what you're suggesting the cause of behavior is, which is that if we just could be a little bit more friendly, if our personalities could sort of envelop the children in our warm embrace, they'll become more receptive to our encouragement, and then they will achieve because they feel trusted, or they feel like someone trusts them. It's really annoying. I left us having that discussion on that panel feeling very down about this entire project. So there have been sort of different tools schools have used that were supposed to take the place of discipline, of merits and demerits, of punishments, and sort of shaping behavior. And the most famous of these are probably restorative practices and SEL. Talk us through these, the rationale behind them, and have they worked?
Yeah, let's do one at a time, because I think they both deserve attention. So something like restorative practices, this comes from restorative justice, which was its own kind of interesting kind of sociology, criminology kind of theory. And the idea with restorative justice was basically that the way the prison system and the disciplinary system was set up was not really fair, not really right. And what should be the case is that if you wrong somebody, then you as the criminal should be able to go to that person, sit down with them, and apologize. Say like, I'm sorry. You could be a murderer, right? And say, I'm sorry, I murdered your family. I did it at the time because I was just crazy or whatever. But I'm really sorry now. And the family can then sort of say, thanks for apologizing. And in some cases can even forgive the person or give them a lesser sentence. And so this was kind of like something out of sociology. I don't think it's a good idea there. But what people ended up doing was adapting it to schools. And in schools, it actually began in a similar way, where let's say there is two kids and one kid is bullying the other kid. In a traditional kind of no nonsense or zero tolerance system, the kid who's being the bully would get a punishment. They'd be put on detention or suspended or whatever. In this system, instead, what you do is you actually take the kid who's the bully and you take the kid who's the victim and you sit them down. And the kid who is the bully is, expected to apologize and to kind of explain his or her actions. And then the victim has the opportunity to forgive them. And if not, then the bully gets punished. And so we can kind of, I think from the get-go, I don't like this, because what it does is it actually kind of puts a lot of pressure on the kid who's been the victim to now reconfront the person who has bullied them, and then also to be responsible for essentially deciding whether that kid is going to be facing greater consequences, which of course could then come back to bite them, once that kid is back, once the bully's back in school. So this is kind of how this started. This was tried in quite a lot of schools, and it kind of evolved over time into a softer form, where it almost turned into kind of like a therapy type thing, where you have these restorative practice consultants going around to schools, And they'd be saying, kids are acting out because of mental health problems. They have a lot of emotion, but they can't quite express it. They've got issues at home, and that's why they're acting out. And and so they would have basically teachers being trained to be group therapists. And this is now the case in a lot of classrooms today around the country. Is the teacher supposed to say start the day by asking each kid, how are you feeling today? They call this restorative circles, right? And this is essentially a group therapy with kids. There's nothing to stop a kid from saying, "Oh, my dad abused me yesterday," right? And he's now disclosing personal information that other kids could, potentially use to re-traumatize this kid or something like that. And yet, this was brought in under restorative practices. So the last thing I'll say about this, and then I can hear what you have to say about it, is that this was touted as this very evidence-based type of thing. It absolutely was not. They did a bunch of studies on it originally that there was no control group. They would just kind of look and see whether this worked to, say, improve school climate or reduce discipline. And eventually they did some experimental studies, and it was basically shown to make no difference. And so we can't even claim this is evidence-based. If anything, it just seems like basically being cruel to kids, especially kids who have been victimized or have genuine mental health issues, bringing all their trauma out into the open. It seems wrong to me. And yet this is kind of considered the way that schools are supposed to deal with behavioral issues.
If people are listening and they may think, well, actually what he's just described, I don't believe in that's perhaps an extreme version of it. What I'm talking about when I say restorative practices is, look, maybe we sit down and talk to the kids together before we make a quick judgment, or maybe instead of reading the policy for behavior by the letter, we kind of dig in a little bit, do a little bit of investigation, and maybe have some chats, right? Even that, with the constraints of how a classroom really works, you have 30 children. It doesn't happen as systematically and as effectively as I think these restorative justice kind of gurus claim that it does. You have 30 kids and you have to teach them about Hamlet, and some kids want to read, right? We want to talk about the characters, and we want to start developing their ability to do all those great things, think critically and so on. And you can't just stop the whole lesson and put everybody else on computers while you go on the side and you do this quasi therapeutic session with the kids that you're just not trained for. That's my reaction when you said this. Like, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts as I bring that to you?
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And it's like what the people have in mind when they're teaching something. I'm talking here about, say, a consultant or an academic, right? Rarely does it ever actually, end up like being practiced like that. And yet I think we should think about what the original intention is. Because if the original intention itself is actually kind of messed up, even if the people who did this really thought it would help and that they thought it would lead to less conflict, I mean, it just seems quite unjust actually to to be treating kids in this way. And if you know anything about kind of basic therapy ethics, the things you're supposed to do and not do, right? One of the biggest things is people aren't supposed to be self-disclosing their emotional issues in front of other people unless they've kind of agreed to that. And that doesn't even get into the issue of whether teachers themselves are prepared or qualified to be acting in this kind of quasi therapeutic role. And so, yeah, I think in terms of how it shakes out in practice, it's not going to be quite as intense as originally designed. And yet, I think what we actually do end up seeing is still not good and doesn't really work.
I think that teachers, and you're alluding to this, I think teachers have sort of been sold a story, have been kind of tricked into thinking that their role extends beyond a someone who imparts the curriculum and is a subject expert for that year level, and is meant to convey the content and get kids to master it. Because you talk to teachers and we have these big meetings, even our courses. My wife's taking a course in library something or another so she can be a librarian in schools. And the whole course is about how are you a social worker in addition to a community center? And how do you lend a Band-Aid to a child when they fall? Everything is about this mission creep going beyond what teachers are really can actually do. We'll get to that at the end. I want you to go into, I don't want to lose our train of thought. Tell me about SEL, which I think many teachers and many districts have sort of embedded in their mission statements, and it has become part of what a school offers in terms of the whole child or developing the whole student.
Right. Well, SEL is or social emotional learning. It's something that's been around for a long time. Actually love telling the history of it because so few people know. It was created by I think it's Howard Gardner. No, not Howard Gardner. And he basically wrote this book. Daniel Goldman, I think that's his name. He wrote this book where he was saying that everyone talks about IQ, right, which is like how intelligent you are. Are you good at solving problems, doing math, verbal things, etc.? He said we talk about IQ a lot, but really what matters in life is EQ, emotional intelligence. And he wrote this book where he kind of tried to make this argument that actually, when we look at what matters in the workplace, social life, etc., it's really EQ, how good you are with emotions, that is predictive of that. And so schools should be teaching students emotional skills. And so he then partnered with, I think, one of the Rockefellers, actually, and they created Castle, which is sort of the big social emotional learning organization. And they started shipping and testing this curriculum and sending it out everywhere. And the idea is that you need to have something in school that teaches kids how to deal with their emotions, improve their emotional intelligence, help them socially, etc. Now, I think at first glance, it's hard to object too much to this, right? Well, yeah, of course, it's good to work on your social skills. Of course, it's good to work on your emotional skills, right? Like, what could be wrong about that? But a few things start to go wrong once we look into it. So first of all, the original book, which was saying that emotional intelligence is more important than IQ, normal intelligence, research on this has kind of shown that actually it's not true. And actually, IQ explains much more of EQ than EQ explains of IQ. And a lot of what we were seeing in terms of these benefits was actually just IQ, just kind of, funneled through another name. And so that kind of discredits the theory behind it to begin with. But what becomes concerning the more we kind of look into the history of social emotional learning is that it's very clear that from a very early start, they kind of thought this was going to take over the entire education system. And they basically saw the purpose of school in the future as no longer going to be about learning, facts, about learning math, etc., but actually just about learning, quote unquote, your purpose, learning, how to be in the world. Kind of new agey, kind of hippie. It's kind of kind of an interesting philosophy. But what we've actually seen is that as social emotional learning has become more and more embedded in school systems across the country, we've basically seen that it's just turned kind of everything in school into this kind of therapy. Where, for instance, there's a great article in the New York Times from, I think, the 2010s, where they're talking about social emotional learning, and they have a football game with the kids. And then after the game, the coach calls them over and says, how do we feel about that game? How did that make everybody feel? And ask them all these kind of probing questions about like their behavior in the game. And as Zach, as you were just alluding to, we now see social emotional learning kind of taking over basically everything. Math teachers are now doing social emotional learning in math about math anxiety. When it's time for history class, we do social emotional learning about activism and how you should actually be using these insights from history to do social justice and stuff. And it's basically just become this combination of therapy and social activism that's kind of marketed in this very kind of milquetoast way, but it's anything but, and it's really taking away from school. Like, it's not school, it's something different.
It's interesting you mentioned Castle, which I didn't know you were going to, but like a lot of times that program is the main citation that I've seen schools use, saying creates whatever effect size, usually small, like certain amount of months per year, in addition to what you would have learned without the program or whatever else. First of all, we have to say that Castle is a program, and you'd have to evaluate what were the components. And there are so many things under that SEL umbrella that oftentimes it's like, is it just about addressing setbacks when a student doesn't solve a problem correctly, right? Is it about giving feedback in a kind way as opposed to in a mean way? Things that are just not controversial. Or and what about the components that are gutting the curriculum of what makes it rich and interesting and filling it with just a lot of discussion around what does everybody think and how does everybody feel about it, kind of taking away this opportunity that kids only have 12 years to experience. That's my biggest issue with it. I think that it's become the object of schools in a lot of places, and it's sort of like part of some sort of anti-intellectual type of element of education, I think.
It is, and it's, again, if you go back to the foundation of it, it's literally premised on the whole idea that intelligence doesn't matter. right? That like knowing facts, being able to solve problems is not the most important thing. Yeah, there's so much that's troubling about it. I mean, what you were just saying about the fact there's so many different programs, how do you evaluate it all? They've done evaluations of the evidence, and even the ones that are sympathetic. I mean, a big thing they say is that it's not high quality. Like, yeah, the studies will show positive effects here and there on academics or emotions, but there's really no high quality research of it. And so we really should just dismiss it because I know it's hard for people to wrap their heads around sometimes, but if studies are not done in a rigorous, high quality way, and especially if they're done by, say, the people or funded by the people that are pushing this, then we just shouldn't trust them. We should demand more. And yet, with education, we constantly see these things being pushed out nationwide with very, very little research. I personally find that very troubling.
Absolutely. I guess that gets to the question like has there been positive or negative effects with these type of approaches, and would you, and you've kind of answered it, would you consider these approaches to be evidence-based approaches?
Yeah, I'll start with that. I just think no. I think at this point, if you want to say that restorative practices is evidence-based, you're just flat out wrong. I think it's just undeniable because there's not been good research showing that. There's been good research that shows that it's not, essentially. And then when it comes to something like SEL, it's hard to kind of say exactly what we're talking about here. But again, the evidence I just don't really think is there. And there's been nothing good that's been done by people who are independent of it. Most of it's very low quality. I don't doubt that there's certain things in there that could be beneficial, right? So if it's a thing of it's like we're going to teach kids to calm down, and then after that we're going to measure whether they're calmer. Like, of course, the kids are probably going to be calmer after you do that. See, I think most of what we learn in terms of social skills, we actually aren't taught like explicitly. We pick it up implicitly, right? Whenever you go into a social environment, you're constantly picking up the cues around you of how other people are behaving. And it's really modeling behavior as opposed to explicit instruction that I think is important. Now, what I do see when I talk to people often is they'll say my kids or the kids these days, they have really bad social skills, right? They'll say, I've got kids coming in and all they can talk about is Minecraft or Fortnite or whatever, and they have no regard for anything else. And I think that's a problem, but I don't actually think that's a problem you're going to be, able to solve by sitting a kid down and then explaining to them like why it's good to be a nice person or something. No, you just have to kind of throw them into these situations, and if they're misbehaving, you kind of have to say no. And that's the way that we've taught people to behave for thousands of years, and it's been pretty successful. And we're just getting too self-conscious about it, right? Like we're too up in our heads about it. We need to just kind of go back, go back a layer and chill.
Well, it's funny how like sort of the misunderstood no excuses charter school movement and sort of its friend in the UK, which is sort of just really rigorous schools like Michaela, it's been platformed down here and so on. These schools teach a form of SEL, which I find it's funny because they don't explicitly teach it as a separate subject. They don't take away from time in school. But there was just a video going around from the Step Lab documentary showing a teacher who's in a very high performing, very strict school before passing out the papers goes, Mr. Hussein printed these out for us. Like, we should really thank him when we see him in the hallway because it was just really kind of him to make sure we had our packets today. Right. And just sort of this embedded approach where there's almost what I would call culture, a cultural approach to SEL, which it just wraps you in everything and everything the teacher does and models and how they expect high levels of good behavior from the kids does for me. That's what achieves the ultimate goal of SEL. What are your thoughts on that?
I 100% agree with that. Like, I think this is sort of a problem that didn't need to be solved that they're now trying to solve. And I said I wasn't going to get political, but I'll add one more political thing to this, which is that SEL is bringing a culture to the school, right? And so we have to ask the question: what is the culture? What are they actually embedding in this culture? And usually there's kind of these layers to it. So at first, when you look at SEL, like I've got the castle wheel pulled up here, which is, it has things like self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, social awareness, relationship skills, right? These are all things everybody wants to know. But then if you look at some of the more advanced materials, or you start looking into transformative SEL or some of their conferences and things, what they mean by this is very political, right? Like they'll say that responsible decision-making is redistributive decision-making. Okay, what does that mean? Well, that's basically talking about taking goods or wealth or whatever from people and redistributing it. Now, whether you're a liberal or conservative, like you can have your own opinion about whether that's a good thing. My point is that this is what they're teaching under the guise of SEL. I've heard stories from teachers and parents about all kinds of horror things where the social awareness aspect or day, they were basically teaching their kids to care about these political causes that they themselves might not agree with. And again, it's like everything is political to some degree. I'm not going to say you can get politics entirely out of schools, but I think SEL is nefarious in the sense of it is actually bringing in this culture that a lot of parents might not be okay with, but it's not being honest about that, right? It kind of puts itself between the kids and the parents and says school is where you get your values, not home. And I think even most parents who might be very progressive or very liberal and might agree with this would object to that and say, actually, I want my kids to get their values at home, and have some control over what's taught at school. But this is just taken for granted.
Yeah, I think there is a growing movement of people from both sides of this of the aisle who are starting to appreciate the role of the school and the role of the parent. Those are often they do not overlap or cross in certain things, and we've hoped that schools could solve some of the issues that would come from homes that are broken or kids come to school without having their needs been met for 4 years, and now how does the school bring them up? But then you get into the problem of seeing abdicating the responsibility from the parents to the school. um I think this kind of goes into like our final area, which is like how responsible are schools for fixing social issues like poverty, inequality, family breakdown, and so on.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think as you were saying that last part, I was thinking about Germany, right? So in Germany, they actually have a very different philosophy. So in Germany, they basically think that the school should be teaching very hyper progressive liberal values, and it's illegal to homeschool your kids in Germany, right? Because they basically think we do not want any ideological diversity amongst our kids. We don't want a repeat of World War II. We don't want more Nazis, and so yeah, we are actually going to pump into our kids' brains these values. And I just think that, in America, we're just not in that same place. Like, I actually think there's a good left, there's a good right, there's obviously bad people on both sides, but there is still that debate, and that should be had. We shouldn't just give that up. I don't think we're anywhere near there yet. But on the final question, yeah, I think there's been this trend, and I think this is actually very academic driven, right? To say that first, that schools cause these problems. So saying that schools cause social inequality or schools cause poverty, family breakdown, etc., basically by denying people the education that they would need to have the kind of lives that they want to have. Or in some cases, it's by excluding kids from school because of disciplinary problems. Now you can't get a job, it's so on and so forth. And so then more recently, we've had the flip back of that, which is like, okay, well, then schools are now responsible for fixing these issues. And I just think it gets it wrong in the first place. It was actually never true that, schools were causing huge inequalities in society. America's had one of the most sort of progressive public education systems ever, and actually were pioneers in this and educating people while many other countries simply did not. Public schools have always been a great engine of social mobility and social transformation, and I actually think that's still true today. And they solve far more problems than we can even really say that they cause. Now, are there like issues with the education system? Of course, just like any other system, but they're not going to be solved by having teachers, feeling like they're part of some corrupt system that needs to be dismantled or something like that. And I really think that this is all kind of a big distraction from just the good functions of public school. But we often see this, there's often these progressive gains that happen throughout society, and when they're new and exciting, the people at the vanguard are on board with them, and then over time we kind of forget how revolutionary and transformative they are, and and then actually now public schools are bad. Like, no, schools are still good, and schooling is still important, and it's really not the job of schools to be solving poverty or family breakdown or whatever, because they can't. But the problems they can solve are undereducation, and they're great at solving that. And we should, make sure that they stay strong and be able to solve that problem.
It's tough because we've been having this discussion on this podcast for 4 years now, but it's like one of the tough things about it all is that you get this classroom and you get a small subset of kids that, despite everything that the teacher can do, even the best teachers, even the superhero teachers, we get 2 or 3 kids per day or per lesson even who just simply do not want to learn, and they fight back and they sabotage lessons constantly, right? And no amount of becoming their friend or building a relationship fixes it. And then in addition to that, just to acknowledge the other side of this, that punishment and rewards and incentives never seem to land. Nothing a school can do is as bad as a punishment as this child has experienced perhaps at home, right? And we don't know what to do with these kids. And until we have that solution, we're going to be stuck, I think, in this space. I mean, what are your thoughts in terms of what schools can do, given we have one kid who really is making it hard for everybody else to learn, but we just don't want to give up on this kid?
I think we have to look at the trade-offs. Let's pause that this one kid is not willing to learn. He's causing problems for other people, and no punishments or anything can help that kid. If this kid is not benefiting from being here because he's not learning, and all this kid is doing is causing problems for other people, then maybe the kid should not be, in this class in the school. I think it's an interesting space to look at. Maybe there are other kinds of educational situations or accommodations that would be better for a kid like that. But ultimately, and I know this comes off as cruel to some people, ultimately I side with the teacher and with the students who want to learn. When I was in school, there were lots of kids who were bullies and were mean and would even act out violently. And sometimes those kids got expelled from the school. I think it's okay. Like this is fundamentally an outcome that we have to be okay with. My hope is it's not too many kids. My hope is we can help them. But fundamentally, I'm going to side with the school being well run, with the teachers, the principal, and the students who are there to learn, over the one kid who's causing the problems. Now, I know sometimes people can get into discussions about maybe that kid, his problems are systemic, right? Or something like that. Or he wouldn't be in that situation if his parents had brought him up in a better environment. Maybe there weren't drugs and things like that. And I think those are all valid things. And again, all things that we should look into. I'm not in favor of kids being, raised around drugs or around violent people at all. But I just don't think that the school system is the place where you deal with that. Ideally, you deal with that earlier. The one thing I will say, and I guess this is giving some credence to the more progressive view in a sort of way, is I do think there are other countries that deal with some of these issues better. For instance, in America, there's great aversion to tracking students. We also have, disability laws and stuff so that we have as many kids, in the least restrictive environment, et cetera. I personally don't favor this. I think that it's fine to have kids with different abilities in different classes. And I think this is actually often better because there's been a lot of research done, and it usually shows that if there's kids who are disruptive or who are not really at the same level, this is just bringing people down. It does not lift the kids to the bottom up. I think when we look at countries like Germany and some of these in the Netherlands and stuff, they have very strong tracking. And oftentimes their kids, instead of getting kicked out of high school, they become they go into vocational school, and they become electricians and things. And obviously not every single kid is going to have that happen. But I do think it is a bit unfair that if you can't sit still and you can't sit through Shakespeare, you're going to be kicked out or something like that. So again, I think the solution to that is more options and more tracks and things for kids. But I don't think it's to say the whole thing is corrupt and it needs to be burned down.
I love it. And we will end there. Jonah Davids, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Your perspective is really welcome. I hope that we can, just listening to what you said, keep an open mind when it comes to different solutions, because I don't know if you've been following some of the different things happening, but a lot of folks in America feeling very downtrodden and essentially that nothing is possible. They see a great video of a great teacher online and they think, well, that's because they're in the UK and they they have the ability to do this and we can't because of our laws, because of the structures in the system. Maybe we should just remove some of those laws and systemic problems and go back to a teacher leading the learning and managing the classroom so that it runs well and the kids can learn. Thank you so much. Listeners, please feel free to give this thing a 5-star rating on the platform of your choosing. Spread it around. I'll keep on bringing new episodes to you every week. Take care.